This video is about money and wealth, safety from poverty. In relative terms, people are poor when their living conditions fall radically below the community average. In absolute terms, poverty refers to insufficient or total lack of basic necessities like food, housing, safe water, healthcare services, and income to obtain the necessities of life. Poverty alleviation has, therefore, become the central policy objective of international developmental agencies such as the World Bank, United Nations, International Monetary Fund, and national governments, especially in third world countries. Poverty alleviation has become a challenging moral agenda in that over 1.3 billion people currently live in conditions of endemic hunger and poverty, while the wealth of the minority continues to increase. How would you state this ethical issue? Think about two stakeholders for whom keeping the status quo is a goal as it relates to wages, poverty, and wealth in the United States or outside of the U.S. Then think about who might be two stakeholders for whom the status quo of low wages and extreme wealth becomes a human rights issue. What are their different points of view, and where do those viewpoints come from? Who benefits from poverty? The answer may be anyone who can purchase cheap goods, or it may be any corporation that every year ensures that it makes a profit to benefit its shareholders. Or it may be the wealthy for whom the government increases tax advantages. Or it may be any employer that uses cheap labor, and as we found out, human traffickers benefit from poverty. That's not to say that every one of those groups of people benefits from poverty. What happens to people in poverty? The answer may be from this information. This comes from 1971 from Hans Herbert Gans, The Uses of Poverty, The Poor Pay All, from Social Policy. This is pretty long. Dirty work gets done, domestic work gets done, professional and business niches get created, recycling contributions. Poverty helps with the recycling of goods and incompetent professionals. A population of poor helps uphold conventional norms. Moral distancing. Poor people are perceived as morally deviant. Cultural contributions such as blues, jazz, country western, even rap and hip-hop have their roots in the underclasses. Security of a social location. Poor serve as a reference point, guaranteeing status of those who aren't poor. Helping others achieve. The poor aid in upward mobility of others. A supply of charity balls. Bearing the brunt of disruptive change. Poor people are often asked to absorb the costs of change. Some examples include urban renewal, volunteer armies, which includes an opportunity but a very risk. Environmental racism, who can least resist having a landfill sited in their neighborhood? And finally, the recession or depression. When people lose jobs, they may take others that push the less qualified further down the socioeconomic ladder. Keeping American politics stable. Poor are less likely to vote or register, and when they do, they vote for Democrats. As more conservative religious groups vote for Republicans, yet neither group gets much besides campaign promises. Finally, if the poor are morally deviant, there is less pressure on other groups to alleviate poverty. The poor pay out a lot in regressive tax revenues, such as sin taxes and the lottery. Low-wage work gets done. It's not just the dirty work. Welfare reform is increasingly designed to push welfare recipients into the workforce. So this is not necessarily my point of view, but it's one point of view. Written in 1971 again by Herbert Gans. How are American people affected by poverty? Who are these poor people? In the late 1950s, the poverty rate for all Americans was 22.4%, or 39.5 million individuals. This number declined steadily throughout the 1960s, reaching a low of 11.1%, or 22.9 million individuals in 1973. Over the next decade, the poverty rate fluctuated between 11.1 and 12.6%, but it began to rise steadily again in 1980. By 1983, the number of poor individuals had risen to 35.3 million individuals, or 15.2%. For the next 10 years, the poverty rate remained above 12.8%, increasing to 15.1%, or 39.3 million individuals by 1993. The rate declined for the remainder of that decade to 11.3% by 2000. From 2000 to 2004, each year, the poverty rose to 12.7. I don't have anything that's more current than that for this particular census. If you look at the poverty threshold from the U.S. Census in 2010, it seems impossible to live on $11,344 as a single person. In some places, it would require having roommates or living on the street or accessing public or governmental supplemented housing, having Medicaid as your primary health insurance, using the food banks, getting clothing at Goodwill or the Salvation Army, never having any savings, probably not owning a car, and being unable to afford education at the college level. Although you might qualify for Pell Grants, money that does not have to be paid back. And of course, it's possible that there are areas in the United States where it's pretty easy to live on $11,000 a year. So this slide is an appalling statistical map. Is this fair? Is it necessary? Is it logical? What can we do about this? And here's a slide just for a laugh. We just wanted to give the biggest breaks to those who pay the most taxes. What could be fairer than that? And this gentleman says, giving the biggest paychecks to those who do the most work. And he replies, you're not from here, are you? Since 1990, CEO pay has grown 571%. If the minimum wage had grown at the same rate, it would now be $25.50 an hour. Here is my perspective. When I was in high school in 1973 to 75, gas for the car I borrowed from my parents cost 45 cents a gallon. Minimum wage was $2 an hour, so I could buy 4 gallons of gas if I worked for an hour at minimum wage. Now, with a minimum wage at $7.25 an hour, it takes 2 hours to purchase 4 gallons of gasoline. When I was in college, hamburger also cost 45 cents a pound, so 4 pounds for 1 hour of work. Now, at about $4 a pound, it takes over 2 hours at minimum wage to buy 4 pounds of hamburger. The problem of wealth. This growing disparity in wealth is poison to democracy. Aristotle understood this over 2,000 years ago when he wrote that democracy cannot function if there are extremes of wealth. U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis understood this problem when he wrote, "You can have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, or democracy, but you cannot have both." Residents of central cities have the highest poverty rate, followed by rural areas. Residents of suburban areas have the lowest poverty rate at about 9%. Married couples are less likely to live in poverty than single female parents, true for all races. Hispanic families have higher poverty rates in all the categories, followed by blacks. Whites have a much lower poverty rate than the other groups. Like nearly half of the Mexicans who live in poverty, 45-year-old subsistence farmer Olivia Zuniga has little hope of a better life as she strives to meet the rising costs of tending her humble plot of land. She is one of the 45.5% of Mexicans who live below the poverty line. That is only down slightly from 2010 levels. Factoring in population growth, the ranks of the poor grew by 500,000 people between 2010 and 2012. Factors used to describe what leads to poverty in 47 countries in Africa include an increase in the rate of population, inflation and external debt servicing, lack of safe water, low economic activities, gender discrimination, ethnic and religious conflicts, and HIV/AIDS. From an article written by Aslin Liang in 2012, more than half of South Africa's children live in poverty, a damning report by the United Nations Children's Agency has revealed. 18 years after the end of apartheid, South Africa is now judged to be one of the most unequal societies in the world, and its 19 million children bear the brunt of the disconnect. The UNICEF report found that 1.4 million live in homes that rely on often dirty streams for drinking water. 1.5 million have no flushing lavatories, and 1.7 million live in shacks with no proper bedding, cooking, or washing facilities. 4 in 10 live in homes where no one is employed, and in cases of dire poverty, the figure rises to 7 in 10. A total of 330,000 children and 5 million adults are currently infected with HIV, and 40% die from the pandemic annually. Child support grants introduced in 1997 now reach 10.3 million children, but another 1 million who are eligible do not yet receive them. Child poverty rates in 18 industrialized countries. How can it be true, and this is in 1998, that the United States has this scary statistic that 21.5% of its children live in poverty. From a Brookings report written in January of 2011, it is likely that overall poverty is actually decreasing throughout the world. I've seen more than one source who's said this, so it's not all bad news. How can we solve poverty? You know from your readings over this semester that this is not a question easily answered. There are too many factors that are dependent on the local community, the type of aid being offered, the effectiveness of the aid, the possibility of education, and whether education really helps. From this article for Living in the U.S., the 3 recommendations for solving poverty include 1. Provide living wages and family-oriented labor policies. 2. Invest in a safety net that supports and promotes economic mobility. And 3. Invest in community solutions run by people who know poverty firsthand. The author, Tiana Gaines Turner, concludes by saying, Congress should not make any decisions about programs meant to help families living in poverty without people who know poverty firsthand at the decision-making table. What can you or I do about alleviating poverty? Perhaps as a student you already live in poverty. Is continuing poverty in the world your responsibility? How can you use your career in service to alleviating poverty, and is that an issue about which you feel strongly? At the micro or personal level, you may or may not be exposed to poverty. At the meso or community level, where do you see poverty? If you live in Boise, are you aware of the homeless shelters and of the homeless? Where does poverty exist in the world, in your country? Food deserts. You watched a movie about food deserts. Does the Boise, Eagle Meridian, Nampa Caldwell area have food deserts? How could you find this out? Google Maps is great for finding grocery stores, but how do you find out where people in poverty live? I actually found this website about the Boise poverty rate, but it doesn't guarantee its accuracy. From an article by Boise State Public Radio, Idaho's poverty concentration has tripled since 2000. Between 2000 and 2010, Idaho's overall poverty rate did go up by about 3 percentage points. During that same time, Idahoans living in high poverty areas went from 6.2% to 18.6%. That's for all Idahoans, rich, poor, and in between. This was an article written by Adam Cottrell in July of 2014. Back to the ethical issues. Are the ethical issues different depending on your point of view? How does whether you are poor or wealthy influence your decision-making about the issues regarding poverty and wealth? It's something to think about. And thanks for watching.